Hey guys, welcome to Literary Devices, Comparative and Descriptive Devices. I'm going to dive straight in because there are a ton of terms to review. Let's do it. So first thing to note is that the very first section has some review terms. These are essentially ones that you should already know what they are. I'm not going to go into depth about them because we should know already what they are. But if you look at one of these and you're like, I don't quite remember, Miss Stokes, go ahead and look them up really quickly so you go in knowing. So analogy, allusion, anecdote, hyperbole, understatement, euphemism, simile, metaphor. If any of those don't ring as familiar, go look them up before you take this assessment, and also add them into your notes if you don't know them off the top of your head. So the first set of terms we're going to look at are antithesis, oxymoron, and paradox. So let's dive in. So what you're going to notice about all three of these, oxymoron, antithesis, and paradox, is that all of these use either contrasting words or concepts that seem like opposites, that seem impossible together. And yet when they come together, it creates a greater meaning that we haven't thought of before. So let's look at oxymoron. This occurs when you take two words and put them directly next to each other. They do, for oxymorons, have to be right next to each other, side by side. And they have to be opposite in meaning. A peaceful war. What? That makes no sense. Generous cheapskate, dark sunshine. These things don't feel possible. But when we think about them, it makes us wonder about a greater truth. What could this mean? What would this look like? And so that's oxymoron. Pretty straightforward. Antithesis has contrasting terms as well, opposite terms, but they're in a parallel structure. The most famous example is, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. The parallel structure is pretty obvious here. It was the blank of times, it was the blank of times. And then within these blanks, we have best and worst, which are opposites. Excellent. Antithesis. Here we have love is an ideal thing, marriage a real thing. So we have blank is a blank thing, blank is a blank thing. And then we have the opposites of real and ideal. And then I guess they're also implying that the marriage and love are opposites, which is a little depressing, but I guess that is their opinion. And so that is antithesis. Lastly, we have paradox, and paradox does not have a sentence structure. It does not have things side by side. It is more conceptual. It is when two concepts that cannot possibly be true at the same time somehow are. Though this be madness, yet there is method in it. In this one, Polonius is talking about how Hamlet seems to be very insane, and yet in his insanity, there seems to be something very sane and true. And so it brings up this paradox of how could you be so insane and yet so sane at the same time? With this one, all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. This is from Animal Farm. And essentially it's saying, oh yeah, everyone's equal. Oh, but there's different levels of equality, which is the opposite of what equality is. And so that's paradoxical. But when you think about these, there is a greater truth in there that's being pointed to, sometimes an unfortunate truth. And so those are our three terms that we need to keep in mind. Let's go to our next batch. So the next set of terms that you might be unfamiliar with are exemplum, enumeratio, and amplification. So let's take a look at what those are. So all three of these, amplification, enumeratio, and exemplum, are different ways to elaborate. So you'll come up with an idea and then you elaborate upon it. And these are three ways in which you would do that, which is actually very helpful to know. So the first type of elaboration is amplification, when you elaborate through imagery with the purpose of aiding the reader in better imagining the topic. It was a cold day, a wicked day, a day of biting winds and bitter frost. That sounds like an awful day. And so what we have here is the concept of a day, but we want to elaborate what this day is like. And so we call it cold and wicked and biting and bitter. And all that imagery helps us better understand the purpose, which is to express how crappy this day is. And so that's how amplification works. Now, when we look at enumeratio, this is when you elaborate essentially by a list. And so you'll have an overarching term, in this case, snow cones, and then, or snow cone flavors, and then there's a list, such as bubble gum and mango. And so, overarching term, list. The conifers, evergreens, like pine and cypress. Okay, overarching term, list. She unpacked her suitcase, overarching term, kind of unpacking suitcase. Her hairbrush and toothbrush and bathrobe and slippers, jeans and shorts, dress and blouses, socks and sneakers, iPad and blah, blah, blah. Okay, so overarching term, list. And so that's how a numeratio or enumeration works. And then the last one, exemplum, it's when you have a concept and you elaborate through an anecdote or evidence. There are so many important moments in our lives. For example, who does not remember the first girl or boy or person that they kissed? And so it comes up with a concept and then it uses like an example, it's sort of anecdotal, but it feels more like an example because it's hypothetical, to help us better understand the initial concept. Do be careful. Sometimes examples are listed and they feel a lot like these more simple lists. But if the list is more complex, it might be exemplum. A really good indication of that, that sometimes students miss, is if you see a list of something that has numbers to it, those are considered examples. I'm trying to think of an example off my head. I can't think of an example off my head. Let me pause the video and think harder. Okay, so I thought of an example. And it's not true, but there are cheeses all over the world, different types of cheeses all over the world. There are 1,000 different varieties of cheese in Italy and 2 million different varieties of cheese in Argentina and 10 variety of cheeses in Texas. And even though that feels like a simple list, the numbers in there make them examples. And so if you see something listed that have numbers in it, that's exemplum and not a numeratio. Okay, so don't get confused there. But yes, so those are our 3 terms that have to do with different forms of elaboration. Okay, so for our next terms that we're going to look at metonymy and synecdoche. Metaphor is thrown in here just because it kind of helps these two make a little more sense. But let's take a look. I'm going to look at this resource, practice distinguishing between these 3. Let's take a look. All right, so a metaphor is when you compare 2 unlike things. For instance, his hands were vine shoots. Hands and vines have have very little in common. And yes, we're comparing them because by imagining what a vine shoot looks like, it helps us better understand what his hands look like. And so that's how a metaphor works, comparing 2 unlike things to help us better understand one of those things. Now, with metonymy, it's kind of the opposite. Metonymy is when you refer to an object with a commonly associated concept or object. Let's look at an example. He took to the bottle after his wife's death. This is very depressing, but essentially what it means is he became an alcoholic after his wife's death. Now, a bottle is commonly associated with alcohol. Alcohol is put in a bottle. So instead of saying he became an alcoholic after his wife's death, it uses an associated concept or object, the bottle, in order to reference what's being spoken about. Let's look at another example. This one's a little more complex. What about the other possibilities? For instance, at about the same time I was smitten, I turned 60, that hulking milestone of mortality. Oof, that's metonymy. That's hard to see. Similarly to illusion, that's super dependent upon kind of like cultural knowledge of things that are related to each other. If you don't catch the cultural connection or was never introduced into the cultural connection, it makes metonymy difficult to detect. But the hulking milestone is essentially treating the age of 60 as like a grave. So the milestone is referencing the tombstone. And so it is taking this concept of death and relating it to like a tombstone. And so, yeah, it's depressing, but it's relating to similar things in one moment. And let's go look at the last one. Synecdoche is definitely a lot easier to understand. So it's referring to the part of something when you mean the whole, or the opposite, referring to the whole of something when you mean the part. Let's go look. All hands on deck. What this really means is people on deck. But when you are running a ship, hands are the most important part of the people. So instead of saying all people on deck, you say all hands on deck, which is part of a person. Now, in contrast, General Motors announced budget cuts. Well, really, all of General Motors at the very exact same time did not talk in unison to announce the budget cuts. Really, like a person or two did this. But instead of referring to the person or two by name, they refer to them as the whole. General Motors announced budget cuts. And so, again, remember, synecdoche can work in both directions. The part of something, all hands on deck, or the whole of something, when you mean the part, General Motors. And so that's the different one of these. Metaphor, easy to notice. Synecdoche, pretty easy to notice. Metonymy, a little harder, but luckily you can use process of elimination to kind of determine when something's metonymy. Awesome. So next up, let's talk about personification and apostrophe. So for the sake of time, I'm going to just explain these because they're pretty straightforward. So remember, hopefully, that personification is when you treat an inanimate object, an abstract concept, or an animal like a human. The chair sassed me, the crocodile smiled, the lightning danced across the sky. Those are personification. Apostrophe is similar in that you speak to an inanimate object, abstract concept. I don't know if animal counts because, we all talk to our dogs and cats, but more so speaking to an inanimate object or abstract concept, that's apostrophe. And so personification would be the chair sassed me, but the apostrophe version of that would be, oh, chair, why do you sass me so? And the reason why I say it like that is because Shakespeare uses a ton of apostrophe. But something like, oh, lightning, you dance across the sky and dance into my heart. You are speaking to the thing as though it is alive. And so that's apostrophe. So hopefully that one makes sense. All right. And last but certainly not least, we are going to talk about eponym and satentia. There's some other ones grouped in here, but those are the two new terms that I want us to talk about. All right, so an eponym is a person after whom a discovery, invention, place, or action is named or thought to have been named. So there's some examples over here. This is a fun little example. So it says, just play cool, don't ted out about it. So if you're familiar with How I Met Your Mother, what Lily really means is just play cool, don't freak out about it. But the character Ted is so well known for freaking out about stuff, they use his name in place of the word. And that is an eponym. When something is so well known for something, it becomes synonymous with the thing it's known for. This is really common in law. If you think about Kleenex, hand me a Kleenex, what you really mean is hand me a tissue. But Kleenex is a brand that's been so commonly associated with tissues that they have become synonymous. Another example is chapstick or Coke. All of these things are actually brand names, but because they're so ubiquitous at this point, they can be used to replace the actual item's name. That's an eponym. So our last term for this video is satentia. So satentia is a moral saying taken from an ancient or popular source that applies the general truth to something. It often occurs at the beginning of a writing or speech. So satentia are those hooks that you used so often in the past where you had a sweet quote at the beginning of your essay and that you were using satentia. Good job, you. And so it's essentially just taking a really well-known quote. Well, it doesn't have to be super well-known, but pretty well-known quote, putting it at the beginning of a speech or a writing and using it to expose some type of truth. That's satentia. All right, so those are the major terms that you probably aren't familiar with, so you are ready to go and take your assessment. Good luck.